The first time Ethan saw Lily, she was sitting on the hostel's rooftop, lost in a book, her dark brown hair tied in a messy bun, a loose sweater slipping off her shoulder. The evening breeze made the pages flutter, but she seemed unfazed, completely absorbed. Ethan had come up for some quiet, needing a break from his noisy roommates, but now, he couldn't take his eyes off her. He wasn't usually the kind of guy to approach strangers, but something about Lily drew him in. Maybe it was the way she absent-mindedly tucked her hair behind her ear or how her lips parted slightly as she read. Gathering his courage, he walked closer and leaned against the railing. "That must be a great book if you didn't even notice me standing here," he said with a teasing smile. Lily looked up, startled, and then let out a soft chuckle. "Maybe you're just not that noticeable," she replied, tilting her head. Her eyes, a deep shade of green, sparkled under the fading sunlight. Ethan laughed. "Ouch. And here I thought I had a presence." She closed her book, resting it on her lap. "Well, you're here now. What do you want?" "Just some quiet. But I guess I'll settle for a conversation instead." And that was how it began, on a quiet autumn evening, with the city skyline stretching in the distance and two strangers finding something familiar in each other. In the weeks that followed, their paths kept crossing. The hostel wasn't huge, but it was big enough that running into the same person repeatedly felt like fate rather than coincidence. Lily would be making tea in the communal kitchen when Ethan walked in, yawning from a late-night study session. He'd be in the common room playing the guitar when she came in, curling up on the couch with her book. One night, they were both in the kitchen, making instant noodles at the same time. "Guess we're on the same diet plan," Ethan joked as he watched her stir the steaming pot. Lily smirked. "If you mean broke college student cuisine, then yes." He leaned against the counter, watching her. "You know, for someone who spends so much time reading, you're surprisingly sarcastic." She raised an eyebrow. "You expected me to be shy and poetic." "Something like that. Sorry to disappoint." "You're not," he said, a little more serious this time. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face, but she quickly covered it up by taking a bite of her noodles. "So, tell me, Ethan, what's your story?" They talked for hours that night. He told her about growing up in a small town in Colorado, how he'd always dreamed of being a filmmaker but somehow ended up studying business instead. She told him about her love for literature, how she'd moved across the country just to get away from the expectations of her conservative family. By the time they finished their food, it was past midnight, but neither wanted to leave. So they sat on the hostel floor, their backs against the fridge, talking about everything and nothing. As the weeks turned into months, they became inseparable. Ethan started bringing her coffee when she stayed up late studying, and Lily would slip handwritten notes into his books, sometimes quotes from literature, other times inside jokes only they understood. One particularly cold December evening, the power in the hostel went out. Students gathered in the common room, wrapped in blankets, using candles and phone flashlights for light. Ethan found Lily sitting on the couch, rubbing her hands together for warmth. "Here," he said, handing her his hoodie. She hesitated. "You'll be cold." "I can handle it." She pulled it over her head, the sleeves hanging past her fingers, and he couldn't help but think how perfect she looked in his clothes. She caught him staring and smirked. "You're thinking something. Maybe. Tell me." He hesitated for a second before saying, "I think I'm falling for you." Her smirk faded, replaced by something softer, something vulnerable. "You sure?" "Yeah." She bit her lip, then whispered, "Me too." That night, under dim candlelight, surrounded by the quiet hum of other students talking and laughing, Ethan and Lily shared their first kiss. It was slow, tentative at first, but then she pulled him closer, her fingers tangling in his hair, and he knew there was no going back. The days that followed felt like a dream. They stole moments between classes, their fingers brushing under cafeteria tables, whispered secrets exchanged in the dead of night. They'd sneak onto the rooftop when the hostel was asleep, watching the stars and making promises they weren't sure they could keep. But love, especially young love, is never without complications. One evening, Ethan found Lily sitting on the hostel steps, her eyes red-rimmed. He sat beside her without a word, waiting. "My parents want me to come back," she said after a long silence. His heart clenched. For how long? Forever. Ethan swallowed. And what do you want? She turned to him, her eyes searching his. I don't know. He took her hand, squeezing it tightly. Then don't decide yet. Not like this. For days, they avoided the conversation, choosing instead to live in the illusion that nothing had changed. But reality had a way of creeping in. On the night before she was supposed to leave, they lay on the rooftop, wrapped in a single blanket. Tell me a story, she whispered. He thought for a moment before saying, once upon a time, there was a boy who met a girl on a rooftop. And he thought she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Lily smiled, but it was sad. And then what? And then he fell in love with her. She traced a finger along his palm. And did she love him back? More than anything. She let out a shaky breath. Ethan, stay. His voice was barely above a whisper. Stay with me. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, he thought she might say yes. But when she looked at him again, there were tears in her eyes. I can't. The next morning, she was gone. Ethan stood outside her empty room, his heart feeling heavier than it ever had. He found a note on his doorstep later that evening. It was short, just a single line in her delicate handwriting. You were my favorite story. Years later, long after college, after dreams had been chased and lives had moved forward, Ethan found himself in a bookstore, flipping through the pages of a novel. His heart stopped when he saw the dedication. For the boy who once asked me to stay. And just like that, their story was never truly over.